Have you ever noticed how some people seem to treat respect like it's optional? As if your time, your feelings, even your presence can be interrupted, minimized, or brushed aside without consequence. And for a long time, you might have tried to handle it politely, smiling, explaining yourself, letting it go, because you didn't want conflict, didn't want to seem difficult, didn't want to become that person. But slowly something inside you began to tighten, not anger exactly, more like a quiet exhaustion, the feeling that each time you tolerated disrespect you were paying with a small piece of yourself. And Stoic philosophy begins exactly here, not with shouting or confrontation, but with a simple question: what is actually within your control? You cannot control how others behave. You cannot force people to be considerate, kind, or mature. But you can control how much access they have to your inner world. And this is where real strength begins. Most people think strength looks loud, quick, reactive, a sharp comeback, a perfectly worded defense. But the Stoics understood something most people never learn, that the person who reacts automatically is the one being controlled, while the person who can remain still has already won. When someone disrespects you, what they're often looking for isn't truth or resolution. It's a reaction, a crack in your composure they can push into, because provoking emotion gives them power. And once you understand this, your entire approach changes. Instead of rushing to defend yourself, instead of explaining why they're wrong, instead of shrinking to keep the peace, you begin to see disrespect as a test, not of your worth, but of your discipline. One of the most effective tools you have in that moment is something so simple it feels almost wrong: silence. Not the awkward, nervous silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the calm, deliberate silence of someone who knows they don't owe a performance. A steady gaze, relaxed posture, no rush to respond, no emotional leakage, just presence. This is not passive, it is controlled. Silence forces the moment back onto the person who created it, and suddenly they're the one exposed, left alone with their words, their tone, their behavior. And most people are deeply uncomfortable when they're forced to face themselves without distraction. You may notice them fidget, over-explain, joke nervously, or change the subject entirely. And that shift is important, because it shows you something. You were never powerless. You were simply giving away power without realizing it. The Stoics taught that dignity doesn't come from being liked. It comes from self-command, from the ability to remain aligned with your values regardless of external noise. And when you choose silence instead of reaction, you're not letting disrespect slide. You're refusing to let it inside you. There is a difference. Letting something inside means it alters your mood, your self-image, your peace. Observing it without engagement means it passes by without leaving a mark. This is why silence feels so uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to explaining yourself, defending your choices, or smoothing things over, because silence requires confidence without validation. It asks you to trust that you don't need to prove your worth in real time. And this is where many people struggle, because they've been conditioned to believe that respect must be negotiated, earned, justified. But Stoicism offers a quieter truth. Respect begins the moment you stop begging for it. When you don't rush to fill the space, when you don't chase approval, when you don't react on command, you signal something deeper than words ever could. You signal that your inner state is not available to anyone who treats it carelessly. This doesn't mean you never speak. It means you speak from choice, not from pressure. It means your words are deliberate, not defensive. And over time, something interesting happens. People who thrive on crossing boundaries begin to avoid you, not because you argued with them, but because there is nothing to grab onto. Others begin to treat you with more care, not because you demanded it, but because your presence quietly requires it. The Stoics believed that the highest form of freedom is inner freedom, the ability to remain unshaken by things that are not yours to control, and disrespect, as uncomfortable as it feels, is one of those things. It says more about the person offering it than the person receiving it. When you understand this, you stop taking it personally, and that shift alone changes everything. You're no longer asking, why are they like this? You're asking, how much access do they deserve? And that question is where self-respect begins to take root, quietly, steadily, without announcement. This first step is not about confrontation, it's about composure, about learning to stand still without collapsing or exploding, about realizing that sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. And once you learn this, you'll never experience disrespect the same way again. Once you understand that composure is power, the next lesson deepens it. Silence is not the absence of strength, it is the deliberate use of it, and this is where most people get it wrong, because they confuse silence with submission, when in reality silence, chosen consciously, is one of the clearest expressions of self-respect. When someone disrespects you, your nervous system often urges you to respond immediately, to correct them, to explain your position, to defend your intentions, because the mind mistakes urgency for importance. But Stoic discipline teaches you to pause before you participate. Ask yourself quietly, is this person seeking understanding, or are they seeking control? If it's control, words will only feed it. Silence starves it. People who behave disrespectfully often rely on engagement to feel significant. They want you to react so they can shape your emotional state. And when you refuse to engage, you remove the reward. This is not avoidance, it is selection. You are selecting where your energy goes. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that his peace depended on his judgments, not on other people's behavior. And silence is how that principle becomes visible in real life. When you choose not to respond, you are not saying, I have nothing to say. You are saying, this does not deserve access to me. That distinction is subtle but powerful. Silence becomes a boundary without explanation, a line drawn without drama. Many people overestimate the effectiveness of words in moments of disrespect, believing that if they just phrase things correctly, the other person will suddenly understand and change. But disrespect is rarely a misunderstanding, it is a test. It tests how much you will tolerate, how quickly you will react, how easily you can be pulled off balance. Silence ends the test by refusing to take it. This is why silence often makes people uncomfortable. It removes the structure they were relying on. Without your reaction, they are left exposed, unsure, and suddenly aware of their own behavior. And here is the Stoic insight most people miss. You do not need to correct every wrong to live rightly. You do not need to win every interaction to maintain dignity. Epictetus taught that freedom is found in focusing only on what depends on you, and your response always depends on you, but their behavior never does. Silence is how you reclaim that freedom. It also protects something precious, your inner clarity. Every time you engage in unnecessary conflict, you rehearse agitation. Every time you explain yourself to someone who is not listening, you teach your mind to doubt itself. Silence interrupts that cycle. It keeps your nervous system calm, your self-image intact, and your values uncorrupted by impulse. This is especially important because disrespect often arrives disguised as humor, sarcasm, or just being honest, forms that pressure you to either laugh along or justify why you're offended. But silence dissolves that trap. You don't need to accuse, explain, or confront. You simply don't participate. Over time, this changes how people experience you. Those who seek reactions grow bored or frustrated. Those who are capable of respect adjust their behavior. Either way, you gain clarity. You learn who belongs close to you and who does not through confrontation, but through observation. Stoicism is not about hardening yourself emotionally. It is about refining your responses so that your energy is spent intentionally. Silence helps you do that. It keeps you from saying things you'll regret, from escalating situations that were never worth your attention, from training others to believe that your peace is negotiable. And perhaps most importantly, silence teaches you to sit comfortably with yourself. Many people speak reflexively because they are uncomfortable with pauses, with tension, with not being immediately understood. Learning to remain silent without anxiety is a form of inner training. It builds confidence that does not depend on approval or agreement. You begin to trust that you don't need to perform to exist. This is not coldness, it is restraint. And restraint, in Stoic philosophy, is a virtue. It means you act from reason, not reaction. It means you choose when to speak and when to withhold, not out of fear, but out of alignment with your values. Silence does not mean you accept disrespect. It means you refuse to absorb it. You are not ignoring reality. You are responding to it wisely. And once you experience the calm that comes from choosing silence, once you feel the relief of not being pulled into unnecessary conflict, you start to recognize how much energy you were wasting before, how many explanations were never required, how many reactions only strengthened the very behavior you disliked. Silence simplifies everything. It clears the fog. It reminds you that you are not obligated to respond to every provocation, and that dignity does not announce itself loudly. It stands quietly, firmly, and unmoved. This is not the final step, but it is a crucial one, because before you can speak with authority, you must first learn when not to speak at all. And in that restraint, your self-respect begins to feel solid, grounded, and unshakable. Once you learn the discipline of silence, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. How often people demand explanations for your choices as if your life were a public debate they are entitled to moderate. Why did you do that? Why didn't you do this? Why would you choose that path instead of the safer one? And at first these questions sound harmless, even caring, but with time you notice something uncomfortable. Many of them are not questions at all. They are disguised judgments. Stoic wisdom asks you to look beneath the surface and ask a harder question. Is this person seeking understanding, or are they seeking control, validation, or reassurance for their own fears? When you explain yourself to the wrong audience, you don't gain respect, you surrender authority. You hand over the steering wheel of your life and invite commentary from people who will never carry the consequences of your decisions. The Stoics were clear about this. You are responsible for your character and your actions, not for managing other people's opinions. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that he did not need to justify his choices to those who did not share his values, because approval was not a requirement for living rightly. The moment you internalize this, your speech changes. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending choices that were never open for negotiation. You stop leaking energy into conversations that only exist to make others feel comfortable with your independence. Most people explain themselves excessively because they fear being misunderstood or disliked. But Stoicism teaches that being misunderstood is not a moral failure. If your decisions are aligned with your values, clarity with yourself matters more than clarity with everyone else. Over-explaining often creates the opposite of what you intend. Instead of convincing others, it invites further scrutiny, more questions, more doubt, until you begin doubting yourself. This is not strength, it is erosion. A calm, concise response, or sometimes no response at all, preserves your center. Saying, "This is what works for me," without elaboration is not arrogance, it is self-trust. It signals that you have already made peace with your choice, and peace is not something you need to argue into existence. People who respect you will accept this. People who don't will reveal themselves quickly, and that clarity is a gift. Epictetus warned against giving your inner life to anyone who had not earned it, and explanations are part of your inner life. They expose your reasoning, your motivations, your vulnerabilities. Not everyone deserves access to that. When you stop explaining yourself, you reclaim time, emotional stability, and confidence. You begin to notice how often explanations were never requested in good faith. You also begin to feel lighter because you are no longer rehearsing your life for an invisible jury. This does not mean you become secretive or hostile. It means you become selective. You explain when there is mutual respect, when understanding matters, when dialogue is genuine. You remain brief or silent when it is not. This selectivity sharpens your presence. Your words gain weight because they are no longer spilled everywhere. And something subtle but important happens internally. Your sense of self becomes quieter and stronger. You no longer need constant external agreement to feel grounded. You trust your own judgment. That trust is visible. People feel it. It changes how they approach you. Those who once pushed for explanations sense that the door is closed. Those who value you engage with more care. Stoicism is not about withdrawing from the world. It is about engaging with it without surrendering yourself. Stopping the habit of explanation is part of that engagement. It teaches you that your life is not an argument to be won, it is a practice to be lived. When you stop narrating every decision, you start living more fully inside them. You act, you adjust, you learn, without constantly translating your choices into language for others. This is not indifference, it is dignity. And dignity, once established, creates a natural boundary that words alone never could. As you move forward, remember this. Explanations are tools, not obligations. Use them wisely, sparingly, and only where they serve truth rather than insecurity. When you stop explaining yourself to those who do not respect you, you make space for something far more important than approval, inner alignment. And from that alignment, confidence grows quietly, steadily, without effort. This prepares you for the next step, because once you stop over-explaining, you begin to see clearly who belongs close to you and who does not, and that clarity leads naturally to the next Stoic discipline. Distance, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. After you stop explaining yourself, a quiet realization sets in. Not everyone deserves the same level of access to your life. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, especially if you were raised to believe that loyalty means endurance, that kindness means tolerance, that maintaining relationships requires constant compromise. But Stoic philosophy draws a clear line between compassion and self-betrayal. Distance is not cruelty, it is discipline. It is the practice of placing yourself where your character can remain intact. When someone repeatedly disrespects you, ignores your boundaries, or drains your energy, the Stoic response is not to argue endlessly or hope they will change, but to adjust proximity. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to justify it. You simply step back. Most people underestimate how powerful this is. Disrespect thrives on access. When access is reduced, behavior often changes, and if it doesn't, the consequence becomes clear. They lose their influence over your inner state. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should choose our company carefully because the soul takes the color of those around it. This is not about superiority, it is about preservation. Proximity shapes mood, thought patterns, even self-respect. When you remain close to those who undermine you, you normalize being diminished. Distance interrupts that normalization. It gives you space to see the relationship clearly, without emotional fog or habitual guilt. Many people resist this step because they fear being labeled cold, selfish, or disloyal. But Stoicism reminds us that virtue is not measured by how much you tolerate, but by how well you live in accordance with reason. You can wish someone well and still remove them from your daily life. You can hold no hatred and still choose separation. Distance is not revenge, it is recalibration. It allows you to redirect energy toward people and pursuits that reinforce your values rather than erode them. When you create distance, You also learn something important about yourself. How much of your exhaustion came from forcing closeness where respect was absent? The relief that follows is often immediate. Your mind feels quieter, your body relaxes, you stop bracing for subtle attacks or dismissive comments. That calm is not accidental, it is the nervous system responding to safety. Stoicism values tranquility not as a luxury, but as a foundation for clear judgment. You cannot think clearly while constantly defending yourself. Distance restores clarity. It also reveals patterns. Some people will notice the space and reflect. Others will react with guilt, anger, or manipulation. Both responses provide information. Neither requires you to change your decision. Epictetus taught that we should not allow others to dictate our inner peace, and proximity is one of the primary ways we unknowingly surrender it. By controlling distance, you reclaim agency. This does not mean isolating yourself. It means curating your environment with intention. Just as you would not eat food that makes you sick out of politeness, you do not maintain emotional closeness with people who consistently disrespect you. This is not hardness. It is health. Over time, you will notice that distance has a secondary effect. It strengthens your standards. Once you experience what it feels like to be around people who respect you, listen to you, and do not test your boundaries, it becomes difficult to tolerate less. Your sense of self stabilizes. You stop questioning whether you are too sensitive or overreacting. You trust your perception. This trust is a quiet form of confidence that does not need to announce itself. People feel it. They respond to it. And those who cannot respect it naturally fall away. Stoicism does not promise that everyone will understand your choices. It promises that if your choices are grounded in reason and self-respect, understanding is optional. Distance teaches you that not every relationship is meant to be preserved in its current form, and that endings do not always require confrontation. Sometimes they require space. Sometimes they require silence. Sometimes they require nothing more than a decision to stop showing up where you are not valued. This is not withdrawal from life. It is alignment with it. As you practice this discipline, you begin to move through the world with less friction. You are no longer constantly correcting, defending, or absorbing disrespect. You are choosing where to stand. And that choice prepares you for the final and perhaps most visible expression of Stoic self-respect: how you carry yourself, regardless of who is watching. There is a reason every ancient philosophy paid attention to posture, presence, and bearing, because the body often speaks before the mind has a chance to explain itself. When you hold your head high, you are not performing confidence, you are embodying alignment. Stoicism teaches that dignity begins internally, but it is expressed externally, whether we intend it or not. People who disrespect others are often skilled observers of weakness, not because they are strong, but because they are searching for leverage. They look for lowered eyes, slouched shoulders, hesitant movements, signals that say permission has been granted. When you walk upright, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, you interrupt that search. You are not challenging them. You are simply unavailable to be diminished. This is not arrogance. Arrogance needs validation. Upright presence does not. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person's worth is shown in how they carry themselves in ordinary moments, not when they are trying to impress. Holding your head high is not about dominance, it is about self-trust. It tells your nervous system that you are safe in your own authority. That safety changes how others interact with you. People feel it immediately. You have likely experienced this yourself. You can walk into the same room on 2 different days and receive completely different reactions, not because others changed, but because your inner state did. Stoicism emphasizes this relationship between inner order and outer response. When you respect yourself, you stop scanning for approval. When you stop scanning for approval, your presence becomes grounded. grounded presence is unsettling to those who rely on intimidation, sarcasm, or subtle disrespect. They cannot find an entry point. Consider how often disrespect escalates when someone senses insecurity. A dismissive comment here, a passive-aggressive remark there, testing to see if it lands. When it does, it continues. When it does not, it often stops. Holding your head high is the simplest way to communicate that their words have no landing surface. This does not mean you feel nothing. Stoicism never demanded emotional numbness. It demanded emotional discipline. You may still feel irritation, discomfort, even anger, but you do not leak it through your posture. You do not shrink around it. You allow it to pass without surrendering your physical dignity. Over time, this practice rewires your self-perception. You begin to see yourself as someone who does not need to prove worth, because worth is assumed. That assumption is powerful. It changes how you speak, how you pause, how you listen. Your voice steadies. Your words become fewer but firmer. You stop over-explaining, not because you are withholding, but because you no longer feel the urge to justify existence. Seneca warned that people often give others power over them by the way they carry themselves long before a word is spoken. Posture is not cosmetic, it is philosophical. It reflects whether you see yourself as an equal participant in the world or as someone asking permission to occupy space. When you hold your head high, you choose the former. This choice does not guarantee approval. It does not prevent criticism, it does something more important. It prevents internal collapse. You are no longer negotiating your worth in real time. You are standing on it. This is especially important when dealing with repeated disrespect. Words can be debated. Explanations can be twisted. Presence cannot be argued with. A calm, upright stance says, "I am here, I am composed, and I am not affected by your attempt to lower me." That message is felt, not heard. And because it is felt, it is harder to challenge. People may still dislike you. Stoicism never promised likability. It promised freedom from dependence on external opinion. Holding your head high is one of the most practical ways to practice that freedom. It reminds you, moment by moment, that your value is not conferred by how others treat you. It is expressed by how you treat yourself in their presence. When you walk away from an interaction without replaying it in your mind, without wishing you had said more or less, without feeling smaller, that is success. Not silence, not victory. Success is leaving intact. As you integrate this discipline, you will notice that disrespect loses its intensity, not because the world becomes kinder, but because you become steadier. And steadiness is something people instinctively respect, even if they never admit it. This brings us to the final understanding, the one that ties every strategy together. Respect does not begin with others. It begins with how you decide to exist in the world. At some point, every Stoic lesson leads to the same quiet conclusion. The way people treat you is often a reflection of what you tolerate. But what you tolerate is a reflection of how clearly you know yourself. Disrespect thrives in confusion, in hesitation, in the moments where you are unsure whether you are allowed to take up space. The moment that uncertainty disappears, many conflicts dissolve on their own. This is not because others suddenly become more ethical or kind, but because you are no longer broadcasting availability for disrespect. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that other people's actions belonged to them, but his response belonged to him. That distinction is where freedom lives. When you stop trying to manage how others see you, and instead manage how you stand with yourself, your entire posture toward life changes. You no longer negotiate your dignity interaction by interaction. You carry it with you. The strategies you've learned are not tricks. They are expressions of a deeper principle. Self-respect is not loud, reactive, or defensive. It is quiet, consistent, and immovable. The silent stare works because it reflects certainty. Silence works because it denies energy to what does not deserve it. Refusing to explain yourself works because your life is not a courtroom. Distance works because access is earned, not owed. Holding your head high works because your body believes what your mind decides. Together, these are not techniques. They are a way of being, a way of moving through the world without asking for permission to exist as you are. Many people struggle with disrespect, not because they are weak, but because they are conditioned to be agreeable, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, even when the peace costs them their sense of self. Stoicism offers a different definition of peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the absence of inner division. When your actions align with your values, when you no longer betray yourself to be accepted, something powerful happens. You stop feeling smaller after interactions. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop wondering what you should have said. That mental quiet is the real reward. Some people will notice this shift and adjust their behavior. Others will drift away. Both outcomes are acceptable. Stoicism does not teach attachment to outcomes. It teaches commitment to character. You are not responsible for teaching others how to treat you. You are responsible for deciding what you will accept and what you will walk away from. And walking away does not always mean physically leaving. Sometimes it means emotional disengagement. Sometimes it means reduced access. Sometimes it means no longer explaining, reacting, or justifying. These are not acts of hostility. They are acts of clarity. Over time, clarity attracts healthier dynamics. People who respect boundaries feel safer around you. People who rely on control feel uncomfortable. That is not your problem. Epictetus taught that if you want to improve, you must be willing to appear foolish to those who don't understand your discipline. Holding your ground calmly will sometimes be misinterpreted as coldness or arrogance by those who benefited from your self-doubt. Let them misunderstand. You are not here to be universally liked. You are here to live without self-betrayal. The deepest shift happens when you realize that respect is not something you demand, earn, or negotiate. It is something you model. You show others how to treat you by how you treat yourself when no one is applauding, by how you stand when challenged, by how you leave situations that drain you, by how little you need to explain. This is not about winning arguments or proving strength. It is about coherence. When your inner standards and outer actions match, you become difficult to destabilize. That stability is felt. It changes rooms. It changes conversations. It changes relationships, not overnight, but permanently. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how you see yourself. You stop asking, "Why don't they respect me?" and start living as someone who already knows their worth. From that place, disrespect loses its emotional charge. It becomes information, not injury. A signal to adjust distance, energy, or attention. Nothing more, nothing personal. Stoicism teaches us that life will always include difficult people. The work is not eliminating them. The work is eliminating the part of us that believes we must shrink to coexist with them. When you stop shrinking, you don't need to fight. You don't need to convince. You don't need to explain. You simply stand, calm and intact, and let the world adjust. That is where real respect begins.